Tyfano, Unraveling Data Mysteries. Join Paul, Joe, and a diverse array of expert guests on Tyfano, Unraveling Data Mysteries, a podcast dedicated to exploring the intricate world of data, insights, and AI. In a realm where talk is abundant but true mastery is rare, we delve deep into the complexities of data science. Our mission is to celebrate those who excel in transforming data into genuine understanding and actionable insights. It's more than just data talk, it's about putting data to work in the real world. Whether you're a data enthusiast, a professional in the field, or simply curious about the power of data, Tyfano offers enlightening conversations and valuable insights into the ever-evolving world of data. The name Tyfano for the podcast has a unique and quirky origin. It traces back to the founders of Tesco, one of whom was John Porter's father. John was a close friend and founding investor in my company Beyond. During the early days of Tesco, when the founders were unsure about the origin of a product, they would exchange a knowing look and say Tyfano, which was their shorthand for fuck Tyfano. This phrase, born out of a light-hearted moment amongst colleagues, encapsulates the spirit of honesty and humour in the face of uncertainty, making it a fitting and memorable name for a podcast that aims to unravel the often perplexing world of data and AI. Hello and welcome to Tyfano, Unraveling Data Mysteries. Thanks for the smile, Joe. I'm your host, Paul Alexandar, and with me is the ever-inquisitive Professor Joe Delahunty, KC.
Yeah, inquisitive and challenging.
Inquisitive
So
and
prepared.
challenging and scary. Today we're diving into a topic that's making waves across the globe, and it's the EU AI Act. It's the EU AI Act is coming into force, and it is leading the way. And the UK are very much behind, considering we had a wonderful conference late last year on AI, brought some leading lights from around the world, and we are just so behind the eight ball. The EU
Okay,
AI
now I'm going to
Act,
stop you there because you're already telling me something I don't know about. So I want to know, what act are you talking about, Paul? What's its relevance?
So I'm going to read exactly what the AI Act seeks to establish a regulatory environment that ensures AI systems are developed and used in a way that is safe, transparent, and respects fundamental rights. It categorises AI systems based on the risk they pose, from minimal risk to unacceptable risk, and applies corresponding regulatory requirements. So it's basically trying to make sure that AI is being used in a responsible manner. But it's also looking at things like, how is AI being used in policing? How is AI being used, and assessing in policing, in education, in all sorts of different settings, to be able to understand what is and isn't an acceptable level of risk for AI to be doing something that a person or being overseen by individuals.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So first of all, it calibrates. It identifies what is being looked at.
It tries to calibrate, yes.
Tries to calibrate.
Yep.
Then it moderates.
Yep.
And then it tries to give guidance.
Exactly, yeah.
Sounds eminently sensible. So you said the EU Act. Why isn't a UK Act?
The UK have been very slow in coming forward with any kind of similar act to the EU. The EU are leading it, and the world may end up, like GDPR, may end up adopting what is the EU stance. But the UK would normally have taken place, had we still been part of the EU, the UK would normally have been at the table in negotiations, talking about the contract, talking about the act, and the way it should be implemented, and would have had a place at the table. The UK, instead of being at the forefront, has basically waited for the EU to come out with the legislation, and is now going, okay, well, what do we do?
Okay.
And the UK are very far away from having a similar act that we can implement into the UK at the moment.
Okay. So in terms of what you want to talk about, I'm adding onto my shopping list whether there's anything controversial in it that the UK shouldn't automatically sign up to. We're not get there yet, but tell me what issues you want to talk about in this podcast about that particular area.
Is the UK actually fostering an environment where AI can be developed? I mean, we held an amazing conference. We had Elon Musk over talking at the conference.
Was that helpful?
No, it really isn't, because it's also what they did at the conference was the AI conference was get the big businesses who are doing AI, but also a lot of small businesses are doing AI at the moment as well, and those businesses were kind of missed in terms of the conference, and they're actually at the sharp edge of leading and developing some of the most innovative stuff that actually organisations should be taking on board.
Good point.
So I think that the lack of legislation, means that the UK is not necessarily a safe environment at the moment for people to develop AI. Technologies, and is an AI technology that is developed in the UK credible and good and should be implemented, or would you prefer to get one from the EU where it's being regulated and there is the onus to make sure that you've got enough data to be able to make sure that the AI models are correct.
Okay.
Within the legislation, there's guidelines on data, on volume of data, and that's a really important thing, because obviously you're training a model based on lots of data, fantastic. If you're training a model on very small amounts of data sets, not necessarily so good. So the legislation provides some guidance around that and has some levels of risk and acceptability of risk based on those kinds of things. Over here, without that kind of similar legislation, we are going to struggle. And
who's we?
We as an industry. I mean,
Right.
we as an organisation are doing lots of AI work. We're trying to use AI more and more in the work that we do, and the business transformation that we do, and how to help an organisation transform. We're looking at models that we can put in place that can help with workforce optimization, for example. Now, the models that we develop, are they going to be as credible, as good as the models in the EU? Or, and actually, if I'm going to develop a model, do I use our UK team to develop that model, or do I use my Lithuanian team to develop that model, because it's more within the regulatory framework, and actually, if I can get the rubber stamp from the EU that actually the models that we've built are compliant and are within the guidelines of the Act, then is that going to be more credible than having exactly the same model built in the UK?
Well, if you got, I can't. I mean, is it a controversial statement to say that it's unsafe in terms of the practices in the UK at the moment? Question one. Because question two, why is it that if we've got effectively the EU equivalent of a BSI kite mark, why aren't people going to adopt that, even though it's not enforceable, it's not enacted in the UK?
Well, the reality
if the work's been done.
The reality is that I will probably use our Lithuanian team to do all of the model builds, or at least a significant proportion of the model build, because it does have that kite mark. Yes, and we as a business, it's almost like going through ISO compliance for us in the UK was a relatively easy exercise, because we were already doing all of the practices that were expected of us for ISO compliance. So let's take the legislation that the EU have built. They have some. Great, fantastic. Let's take that legislation and let's apply that to the practices that we as an organisation have in the UK. So when the UK actually does finally catch up, we're already compliant. We're already there. Now, for every good organisation that is going to do what we do, which is try and be ahead of the curve, try and be ahead of the legislation, before GDPR came in, we were having conversations with the Information Commissioner's Office. We were at the forefront of the conversations, making sure that everything that we were doing was compliant. And if we had the slightest doubt about it being compliant, we were having a conversation with the ICO to say, could you tell us whether this is safe or not safe with data? Let's do the same thing. We as an organisation are going to do that, and we're going to be ahead of the curve. There are so many organisations out there that will, they build AI models because it's a fun thing to do, it's the right thing to do, because that's the way the industry's heading. It isn't legislated at the moment. They will not necessarily all be the same as us in the way that we approach it. So there are people who will be playing fast and loose with the data and fast and loose with the models, and training models based on limited data sets and limited understanding of the potential impact and the outcome.
So in terms of your approach, do you think it's right effectively to sign up to the EU legislation as a kite mark of excellence and safety?
Yes.
Answer yes. You've identified those groups that won't sign up. They're going to be the mavericks. They may be the ones that feel restricted by it. They may be ones that politically with a small p don't want to sign up to it because it curtails their freedom. How is the public going to identify who is a safe choice, who's a safe provider?
I don't think the public, well, in number one, you have to provide the information to the public on what part of the legislation is also surfacing the fact that you are actually talking to an AI model, or this is an AI model that is presenting the information to you. So the legislation provides for that in the EU. So if you're talking to if you're using something and it is a model, it's model based and it's AI based, then you will know that as a member of the public.
Okay, so it's like a declaration.
It is a declaration
Transparency
of
issue.
It's open, and it's open about the way that your data and what you're doing will be used in the future. And again, certain people are ahead of the curve on those sorts of things. There is no onus to provide that declaration in the UK. So because there is no legislation, you don't have to you don't have to subscribe to that as an organisation. You can just run a model. The EU legislation is very good as far as the public is concerned. It's very good as far as actually having the legislation open. It opens up AI to the public to understand, to help them understand. Of course, not everyone's going to understand it because some of it is very complicated, and the way that it's attended to is very complicated. But it does provide some level of understanding or exposure to the public of this is what's happening, this is how your information is being used, how it will be used in the future, how what you're doing will impact on the models and the self-learning algorithms that are within the models. So that part of the legislation, again, it's fantastic. It's a bit, it's a bit like telling people to, getting people to automatically opt into hearing from organisations rather than explicit exposure rather than implicit. So that explicit versus implicit is something, again, that the legislation attends to quite well.
Okay, well, since I knew nothing about the legislation before you started telling me about it, and now I'm entirely convinced it's the hallmark of excellence, it seems to me that there's going to be a drag by reputable companies to tend towards that standard.
Yep.
But then you're going to have the outliers. So there are three ways, are there not, where that drag to excellence can be pulled along. It's press, the public, and politicians.
Yeah.
The public aren't going to do it if they don't know what the app provides to them. But the press may become interested, but it's the politicians that should be guiding this forward. So what can you tell me about why it is that politically, with a small p, why is it there hasn't been a drive in the UK to sign up to this hallmark of monitoring and performance and transparency that's clearly so critical?
I think lack of single point ownership. I think that there are many different people who think that they own something to do with AI and own something to do with technology. We have failed to really put any kind of committee together.
So Paul, tell me, if I'm looking as an outsider to see where I will hear and see the authoritative voice and representation for the standard bearers in the UK, where do I see it?
You won't.
Why not?
Because there isn't one. The Information Commissioner's Office equivalent for AI does not exist today in the UK. So, and again, the ICO is a very good body. It creates the legislative context for what the UK does as far as using personal information and using data. You translate that into AI. There is no similar organisation in the UK that does the same thing for AI. It just does not exist today. It hasn't been set up by government. There are politicians that are talking about it, but there is no equivalent of the Information Commissioner's Office or to, and it's arguably held by lots of different organisations today. So lots of different organisations, such as Ofcom, for example, will have a perspective on the use of AI within their industry setting, but there is no one that is driving, no single organisation in the UK at the moment that is driving the legislation to deal with AI in the same way that the EU have done.
Okay, so look, on the ground, it seems to me that AI in all its forms is progressing at the speed of light, and it's broken the sonic barrier. And yet regulation is still back in the Stone Age.
Yeah.
So what's going to change?
Very little in the short term, because the legislation regarding the ICO's in flux at the moment. The new legislation on the DPDI legislation that is going through the House of Lords at the moment is taking forever to go through. So the UK are really, really lagging behind everyone else because they just don't know which way is up.
So what does that mean? What's the global implications, therefore, for the UK's industry if we don't see any active signs of change, but the EU have taken up the issue?
Well, does the rest of the world take the EU legislation and actually explode that globally? But again, what does that mean, and how's that actually implemented? At least the EU have taken an advanced stance, and they've got themselves organised. So you could look at it really positively and say, well, actually, they've got themselves organised. Let's just use that legislation as the blueprint for what legislation needs to happen globally. Again, it has implications on the way in which different states, different territories collect data, use data, and use AI for the management of their state. So the way in which the legislation may be adopted by somewhere like Singapore might be very different to somewhere like the UK. So as with any piece of legislation, there are nuances. But broadly, when GDPR came in, most of the world sat up and went, actually, that's a really good piece of legislation. Let's go and try and replicate it, like they did in Australia, for example. So hopefully, the EU legislation, the fact that the EU has the legislation, it creates that blueprint, and it arguably is a fast track for Let's take the EU legislation, punch it into ChatGPT, and say make that relevant to the UK, and the job's done. Obviously, that's not the way the world works, and that's not the way it will happen. But the world has an opportunity to actually start to adopt their legislation, and it has really important implications for things. The way that we collect data. It's not just the way that we collect data, but also the way in which we write code, and making sure that that is well documented as well, so that we know how the algorithms are created, and we know how the code is written, so that we can understand and expose that. So you can say this is how it calculates what it does, and so the onus within the Act on documentation, record keeping, data, the environment it's stored in, all of those things are attended to. Now, those would seem to be really clever things for the rest of the world to get on board with.
So coming back to in the absence of regulation, particularly statutory regulation, you're looking for voluntary adherence to a good practice code. Is that what your company is doing?
Yes. But for every company like us, there are probably 10, I couldn't give you the statistics, but there are, a number of nefarious organisations that will not be adhering to voluntarily adhering to the code, because you can make more money faster, frankly, if you just crack on.
Okay, so if I'm an outsider, as I am, and I'm looking to understand who the safe guys are, what do I see, for example, on your website, your company's website, that indicates what standards you uphold and why?
At the moment, nothing. We haven't done any. We have ISO compliance, and we have ISO compliance in the way that we handle data, and the way in which we govern ourselves, and the way in which we communicate internally, and make sure that none of the data that or the information that we have as an organisation is used inappropriately. At the moment, we have nothing on our website. Or on our, or even on our emails, that says that we are voluntarily adhering to the EU AI Act.
But you're doing that.
Sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
It sounds like a very good idea.
Yeah.
So I think this podcast should be the announcement that your website will now identify you one as the industry leaders in the UK that is voluntarily signing up to the
I'm sure there's
EU
someone in the corner of a room somewhere just updating our website as we speak.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
That's exactly it. It's good to get something constructive in terms of commitment from you at the end to action. Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. Yeah, you put me on the spot and I'm blushing again. I know I am.
Well, it just seems so bloody obvious. Why aren't you doing that? It's just
the obvious is not always apparent, and I think that's clear for most organisations. There is, the EU Act has kind of sideswiped a lot of organisations.
I know nothing about it. It seems to me the in order to educate the public so they can be informed consumers, there needs to be something really simple about what the EU Act does. And I think the point you made about its codes as well is a really important one that's not been covered in this podcast, and we need to come back to it.
Yep.
So in terms of accessibility and transparency of information, for a company such as yours who's unafraid of being held up to account, to have a very short, at-a-glance bullet point guide as to what the EU Act is, plus a rationale, a principle, a statement to say why you're signing up to it, that should be the kite mark that we are able to look to as consumers to say that's an organisation I can trust.
Yeah.
Otherwise, how are we going to know?
Yeah. Look, we as an organisation, because we are multinational, we as an organisation, have to adhere to it anyway. We've got a very advanced team in Lithuania within the EU. And it makes absolute logical sense that we would be on the advanced party for all of this. The big organisations, will be on the advanced party as well. The likes of Google and Facebook and all of their, Meta. All of them are at the edge, and are making sure that they are on the bleeding edge of all of the legislation. They have to be. There are many organisations that will fail to turn up unless we educate them.
Right, so having listened carefully to what you've had to say, I've become increasingly concerned that we are in an unregulated zone. And it seems to me the EU Act is the start point of what's going to be a very constructive, powerful and vital conversation in the UK. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. And I think this is not the first time or the last time that you will be hearing about this. And certainly as far as the podcast is concerned, I'm sure we're going to be covering this on multiple occasions moving forward.
And that's also a jump-off point to remind anyone listening that if they've got any questions arising from what we've discussed or areas they want to explore further, then they should chip in and post, and we can pick that up later.
Absolutely, yeah. Our listeners' perspectives will enrich our discussions.
That's a good note to finish on. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers.